In this video, we will not only discuss the high-profile disappearance of Stephen Gregory Stayner, but also the tragic fate of his older brother. This is perhaps one of the most astonishing stories I've ever told on this channel. Usually, when I cover such cases, they often end with the victim either remaining missing or being found deceased. However, this story is quite unique. It has elements of horror, courage, and a fight for survival. So let's get into the details. Stephen was born on April 18, 1965, in Merced, California, to Delbert and Kay Stayner. His parents raised 5 children, including Stephen, and the family lived a relatively peaceful life until December 4, 1972, when everything changed. On that day, 7-year-old Stephen was walking home from school when he was approached by a man named Irvin Edward Murphy. Irvin told Stephen that he was conducting interviews on behalf of a church and collecting donations for its needs. Stephen, assuming his mother would support this, agreed to help Irvin by providing information. As Stephen spoke, a white Buick pulled up beside them. In a surprising turn of events, Stephen willingly got into the car, unaware that this simple act would mark the beginning of a nightmarish kidnapping. From that moment, Stephen's terrifying ordeal started. He was driven to a cabin far from his hometown by Irvin and his accomplice, Kenneth Eugene Parnell. Kenneth Parnell, the mastermind behind the kidnapping, was a man with a very disturbing past. His childhood and youth were troubled, filled with hardship and early criminal activities. Kenneth's father abandoned the family when Kenneth was just 5, leaving him with a sense of neglect. Over time, Kenneth began committing various crimes, including stealing cars and setting fires, which eventually led to his imprisonment at a young age. Kenneth's troubled behavior didn't end there. When he was 20 years old, he posed as a deputy sheriff to lure an 8-year-old boy. Kenneth then assaulted the child and was sentenced to just 4 years in prison. Despite this, Kenneth continued his pattern of criminal behavior. He even attempted to escape custody several times, only to be returned to prison. Psychiatrists who evaluated Kenneth noted his abnormal behavior from an early age. As a child, he attempted bizarre acts, such as removing his own teeth and throwing himself from the roof of a barn, which was covered in nails. These early signs of self-destructive behavior hinted at the more dangerous tendencies he would exhibit later in life. Irvin Murphy, the man who helped Kenneth kidnap Stephen, was described by friends and family as a simple, naive individual who lacked the ability to understand the true gravity of Kenneth's intentions. He was easily manipulated by Kenneth into participating in the abduction. Both men had met while working at Yosemite National Park, Kenneth as a night janitor and Irvin in an unknown role. Working together, Kenneth convinced Irvin to help him kidnap a child under the pretense of raising him with religious values. The 2 men abducted Stephen and took him to Kenneth's house. There, the psychological manipulation began. Kenneth told Stephen that his parents no longer wanted him and had handed over custody to Kenneth. For a young boy, these lies were devastating. Stephen was led to believe that he was no longer welcome at home and that Kenneth was now his legal guardian. This was just the beginning of years of torment and brainwashing. Kenneth went to great lengths to erase Stephen's past identity. He renamed him Dennis Gregory Parnell and even enrolled him in local schools as if Stephen was his own son. Over time, the 2 moved frequently across California, with Kenneth continuously telling Stephen that his parents didn't want him back. These lies and the frequent relocations made it nearly impossible for Stephen to escape or even comprehend his situation fully. Throughout his captivity, Stephen was subjected to unimaginable abuse and manipulation, yet despite this, he maintained a strong sense of resilience. Kenneth's efforts to turn Stephen into a compliant child succeeded for years, as Stephen struggled with his conflicting emotions. He was too young to fight back, but as the years passed, Stephen slowly began to question the story Kenneth had built around him. Kenneth Parnell's violent and criminal tendencies were deeply ingrained, and his behaviour was not a result of one isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a lifetime of deviant actions. His manipulation of Irvin and later Stephen demonstrates how dangerous individuals like Kenneth can cause untold damage to the lives of others. While Irvin may have been naive, Kenneth was the true puppet master behind this horrifying ordeal. Kenneth held various jobs, often leaving Stephen alone at home. Surprisingly, he allowed Stephen to drink alcohol despite his young age and granted him the freedom to leave the house. However, Stephen always returned, as he believed Kenneth's lies that he was his legal guardian. Stephen later explained that while he could leave, Kenneth's manipulations had convinced him he had no other options. During their time in Santa Rosa, a woman named Barbara Matthias lived with Kenneth and Stephen for about a year and a half. Barbara claimed she was unaware of the abuse and believed Kenneth was Stephen's biological father. Shockingly, Stephen revealed that in 1975, Kenneth instructed Barbara to help lure another boy from a local teen club. The kidnapping attempt failed, but Stephen's account raises questions about Barbara's claims of ignorance. How could she not have noticed the obvious tension between Stephen and Kenneth? Their lack of resemblance and Stephen's visible discomfort around Kenneth made her denial hard to believe. Despite the circumstances, Stephen spent years in captivity, enduring unspeakable abuse while frequently travelling with Kenneth. This ordeal continued until March 1st, 1980, when 14-year-old Stephen saw an opportunity to escape. By then, Kenneth had lost interest in Stephen, as the boy had reached puberty, which seemed to shift Kenneth's focus toward younger victims. Kenneth began planning the abduction of another child, and even attempted to force Stephen to assist. Stephen was horrified when Kenneth tried to make him act as an accomplice, similar to how Irvin Murphy had aided his own abduction. In February 1980, Kenneth kidnapped 5-year-old Timothy White from Ukiah, California. Unlike Stephen, Timothy spent only a short time in captivity. On the night of March 1st, Kenneth left for work as he often did, leaving Stephen and Timothy alone. Seizing the moment, Stephen took Timothy by the hand and walked into town, determined to save him from further harm. After searching unsuccessfully for a safe place for Timothy, Stephen made a life-changing decision. They went directly to the police station. At the station, Stephen told officers everything, including the chilling truth about his own captivity. He famously said, "I know my name is Stephen. I'm 14 years old. I'm not sure of my real birth date, but I use April 18th, 1965. I think my last name is Stayner, but if I have another name, I don't know it." These words, filled with both clarity and confusion, became the title of a book and TV movie about his ordeal. Stephen's escape was miraculous. A boy who had been presumed dead for 7 years not only survived but also saved another child. The media erupted with coverage, and Stephen became a national hero. On March 2nd, 1980, Kenneth Parnell was arrested and eventually convicted on 2 counts of kidnapping. Shockingly, he was sentenced to just 7 years in prison and served only 5. This lenient sentence outraged the public, as Kenneth had committed far more heinous acts than the charges reflected. Kenneth's accomplices received similarly light sentences. Irvin Murphy, described by Stephen as kind to him early on, was charged with aiding in the kidnapping. Stephen believed Irvin was manipulated by Kenneth, possibly showing signs of Stockholm Syndrome. However, this does not absolve him of responsibility for his role in the horrific events. It is difficult for me to judge, but in a rather popular program, Stephen was asked if his parents had changed over the years and whether he recognized his older brother and sisters. Although it was great that he returned home, it was also difficult for him to get used to normal life. As strange as it may sound, over the years, he had kind of gotten used to being the only child in the family. Now he had to live in the same room with his older brother, Carey, and share things with other children. Stephen's brother and sisters were happy to have him home, but it was believed that Carey didn't really want to share a room with him. In addition to family tension, Stephen faced severe bullying at school. It wasn't just the presence of TV cameras constantly surrounding him. It was the way everyone knew about his ordeal and the abuse he suffered. Classmates speculated about his orientation, with many assuming he liked boys. Yes, it was a different time. But even now, teenagers can act cruelly. It's hard to imagine what Stephen went through. Perhaps this treatment contributed to his decision to drop out of school. He started drinking alcohol again, which strained his relationship with his father. In an interview, Stephen mentioned that his father no longer hugged him as he used to. He felt his father showed no feelings for him and believed he even felt disgust. Stephen explained that when he returned home, he was almost an adult, but his parents saw him as a 7-year-old boy. Over time, things improved, and Stephen noted that his relationship with his parents only stabilized once they stopped treating him like a child. Stephen continued to speak with journalists for years. In 1985, he married 17-year-old Jodie Edmondson. They had 2 children, Ashley and Stephen Jr., and lived in Merced, California, where Stephen had been kidnapped. He worked in a pizzeria and volunteered with a group focused on preventing child abductions. Tragically, Stephen's life ended on September 16, 1989. He was returning home from work on his motorcycle when he collided with a car driven by Antonio Loera. He died almost instantly. Shortly before his death, a 2-part miniseries called Also Known As aired. Stephen had served as a consultant for the project and played a small role in the series. While he enjoyed the work, he expressed dissatisfaction with how the series portrayed his parents as intolerant. A few years later, Stephen's publicist Michael J. Eccles published a book titled. Eccles had thoroughly researched the case and conducted interviews with Stephen and Kenneth Parnell. Through the series and book, Stephen's story became immortalized. In 2010, the city of Merced went a step further by unveiling a bronze statue of Stephen holding Timothy White's hand, symbolizing the moment he led Timothy out of Kenneth Parnell's house. Stephen's story remains both tragic and heroic. Residents of Merced continue to recount the hardships he endured and his incredible bravery in seeking a normal life. However, the attention given to Stephen left his siblings feeling overshadowed, particularly his older brother Carey. He grew up angry and resentful, and in an unthinkable twist, Carey's life took a much darker path. In February 1999, Carol Sund, her daughter Julie Sund, and their friend Silvina Pelosso disappeared during a sightseeing trip to Yosemite National Park. On March 18th of that year, Carol and Silvina's bodies were found burned beyond recognition in the trunk of their rental car. Dental records were needed to identify them. Investigators found that Carol had been strangled and shot, while Silvina had suffered a horrific assault before her death. Just a week later, police received a letter with a hand-drawn map indicating the location of a third victim, 15-year-old Julie Sund. At the top of the letter were chilling words. "We had fun with her." In the end, the investigators went to the indicated place and indeed found the remains of the deceased girl. When Carey Stayner, who was 11 at the time, heard the news, he was in complete confusion. He was the older brother and therefore felt guilty that he could not protect Stephen. The kidnapping of his brother haunted him for many years. According to Carey himself, after Stephen's disappearance, he developed a kind of tradition, or rather a ritual. Almost every night he went outside, looked up at the stars, and made a wish for his younger brother to return home. He did this exactly until Stephen finally returned. Even after Stephen's return, Carey continued the ritual, going outside every evening, walking several blocks, choosing the right star, and repeating the same wish until he reminded himself that Stephen had returned home. Of course, this seems sweet if you don't consider that in the future, Carey became a real monster. A sad fact about his childhood was that after Stephen returned home, Carey faded into the background. Let me remind you that when Stephen disappeared, Carey was only 11 years old. In other words, he still needed parental care. However, despite this, His parents shifted their focus entirely toward finding Stephen, and when Stephen returned, they became occupied with the media attention surrounding his story. Carrie and his sisters were left on the sidelines. During this time, Delbert Stayner, their father, constantly wavered between two versions of himself, one entirely consumed by fatigue and depression, and the other focused on finding his youngest son. But how did the other children feel? How did it feel to watch their parents change and stop paying attention to them? In this environment, it seemed impossible for Carrie and his sisters to develop into normal people. Carrie had unique abilities and talents that his parents simply didn't notice. When he was in high school in Mercedes, he was named the most creative student. Some believed he would become an artist or a cartoonist. He was also great at baseball, and nothing seemed to indicate that he could become a killer. However, he was always quiet and withdrawn, aware that his parents would never consider his feelings since they were consumed with finding Stephen. Carrie was also described as one of the nicest people, and no one seemed concerned about his behaviour. By the time Stephen returned, Carrie was 18 years old. Perhaps by that time, he had resigned himself to the fact that he would never see his brother again. But when Stephen did return, Carrie felt displaced. Stephen was the hero, and everyone treated his return as a miracle, while Carrie was just Stephen's brother. Mike Eccles, a family friend who lived nearby for about 20 years, recalled that after Stephen's return, Carrie was put on the shelf. Despite all his talents, he remained in the background. Another longtime neighbour mentioned that the publicity surrounding Stephen built up a sense of neglect in Carrie. He felt as though no one, not even his parents, paid him attention. This desire for recognition was natural, but Carrie's alienation and inner turmoil worsened after Stephen's death. It would seem that when Stephen died, his story should have ended, but instead, it only strengthened his legacy. Meanwhile, Carrie struggled with his own emotional detachment and feelings of loss. At some point, his alienation and loss of contact with his family led him to move in with his uncle Jesse Stayner. Shortly after they started living together, Jesse was found dead in his own home. Despite a thorough investigation, the killer was never found. When this case appeared in the newspapers, the headlines only mentioned the murder of uncle of Stephen Stayner, and Carrie's name wasn't mentioned at all. It was as if he didn't exist. At least, that was the thought that tormented him. By that time, Carrie had worked in various fields. He made a living by replacing broken windows. It was at one of these jobs that he met a man named Michael Marchetti, who was something of a colleague. One day, Michael caught Carrie breaking glass and plywood. Carrie told him he had a nervous breakdown and that he wanted to come to work and kill everyone there before setting the place on fire. To me, this was a clear alarm signal. Shortly after this incident, in 1997, Carrie changed jobs and became a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel, located near Yosemite National Park in California. It was a quiet place where Carrie could earn a living while enjoying the surrounding nature. However, this peace lasted only until February 1999, when Carol and her daughter Juliana, along with their friend Sylvina, disappeared during a sightseeing trip to a national park. According to FBI agent Jeffrey Ricks, who was investigating the case, the search for the missing persons became the largest ever conducted in the territory of a national park. As I mentioned earlier, the bodies of all three victims were found in the car Carol had rented, about 60 miles from their tourist cabin. The charred remains of Carol and Sylvina were in the trunk, while Julia was found later, about 40 miles from the car, after the police received a letter with a hand-drawn map of the area. At first, detectives began questioning the employees of the motel where the victims stayed shortly before their deaths. One of these employees was Yene, who at the time did not have a criminal history and remained calm during the police interrogation. Later, the authorities focused on former prisoners Michael Roy Laverick and his half-brother Eugene Earl Dax. Dax had multiple convictions for theft, illegal possession of weapons, and the sale of illegal substances. Laverick, whose house was next to the found car, had allegedly shot and killed a police officer who tried to detain him. In other words, they seemed like ideal suspects, and it was understandable why the FBI agents thought the investigation could be concluded. However, from the beginning, the detainees denied any involvement in the crime, even offering to take lie detector and DNA tests to clear their names. Though not innocent, they were eventually proven to be wrongfully accused. Unfortunately, it wasn't until July 22, 1999, when 20-year-old naturalist Joey Armstrong, who worked in Yosemite National Park, was found decapitated near his cabin. Detectives found several pieces of evidence at the scene, but the main focus of the authorities was Cary Stayner's car. Several eyewitnesses reported seeing his blue 1972 International Harvester Scout parked near Joey's cabin the day before the murders. Detectives decided to track the car, which eventually led them to the now familiar suspect. FBI agents John Bowles and Jeffrey Rennick discovered that Cary had stopped at a nudist resort, Laguna del Sol, located in Wilton, where he was eventually detained. At the time, Stayner wasn't considered a serious suspect. However, during the interrogation, he shocked the agents by stating that he would provide far more information than they could have expected. Alone with Jerry, Rick, Sylvie and Juliana, Rennick later wrote about this in his book. He described his time with Cary, and also mentioned a chilling request that the criminal made before his confession. Before admitting to the murders, Cary asked Rick to give him photographs of young girls, offer his relatives a cash reward, and ensure that he ended up in a federal prison as close as possible to his parents' home. Jeffrey told Cary he could only choose one, and without hesitation Cary chose the photographs. Rick knew Cary would eventually confess, and the police were aware that Cary might want to gain some notoriety by committing these monstrous crimes. Cary claimed his desire to kill had started when he was 6 or 7 years old, even before Stephen's kidnapping. At the time of his arrest, Cary was already 37. It seems he had been fighting these desires for decades. While on death row, it's possible he continues to battle his demons, though that remains uncertain. But this raises the question, why did Cary finally give in after so many years? Perhaps it was inevitable. A psychiatrist who examined Cary for signs of mental illness offered a different theory. He believed that Stephen was not the only child in the family who had been subjected to abuse by an adult. According to available records, Bert Stayner, their father, had undergone special treatment after developing an attraction to his daughters. Cary also became a victim of abuse by his relative uncle Jesse Stayner a few months after Stephen's kidnapping. You may recall that Jesse was shot shortly after Cary moved in with him. It is not surprising that after Cary's arrest the case of his uncle's murder was reopened. It was clear that crimes involving indecent acts were deeply embedded in the Stayner family. While Stephen's case was straightforward, as he was a victim of kidnapping, Cary's case was far more complex. He appeared normal in childhood, and as an adult, even his friends had no idea of the person he would become. He really was, and this once again proves the theory that we never truly know which of our friends or relatives is a normal person and who masterfully hides their dark side. The story of the Stayner brothers is considered unusual for many reasons. In fact, Stephen and Cary experienced certain traumas, but their life paths turned out to be so drastically different. Stephen became a real example of fortitude and courage, while Cary became a cruel serial killer. Stephen faced unimaginable evil as a young child. Yet this did not stop him from escaping captivity and even saving another boy in the process. He managed not only to reintegrate into society, but also to build a family. On the other hand, Cary also faced significant challenges. He allegedly became a victim of inappropriate actions by his uncle, a man with whom he should have felt safe. This trauma, combined with the emotional void created by his brother's disappearance, likely worsened his inner struggles. Perhaps Cary was also in a type of isolation, much like Stephen. However, the key difference in his story was that he never received the attention or support from society or his parents. As a result, he could not cope with the overwhelming feelings of rage. Carrie's life might have turned out differently if he had received the necessary care and support. But if his claims that his dark inclinations existed even before Stephen's abduction are true, then his descent into violence might have been inevitable. One could assume that Stephen was driven by the sudden public attention he received, which pushed him to make every effort to lead a normal life. In contrast, Carrie remained in his brother's shadow the entire time. Many believe the greatest irony in this story is that, while Stephen returned to normal life, Carrie's actions overshadowed and ultimately erased any legacy of his brother's heroism. When a person loses control and succumbs to dark impulses, their actions become unpredictable, especially when you're 10 years old. How do you escape such a situation? Is luck enough to avoid impending danger? In a quiet corner of Texas, not far from the town of Pampa, there was a remote farmhouse where an extraordinary family lived. Robin Dewan lived here with her mother, Michelle Conrad, her older brother Zach, and her stepfather Brian. Their farm thrived thanks to the hard work of the head of the family, who had built a successful agricultural business. The children enjoyed a peaceful life in the country where calm and quiet normally reigned. Their story began when Michelle met Brian after separating from the children's biological father. Brian quickly connected with the kids, and they soon married and started their life together. In the autumn of 2005, Michelle, 6 months pregnant, awaited the baby's arrival, and everyone eagerly anticipated it, especially Brian, who dreamed of having his own child. Robin, who had turned 10, was exceptionally smart and determined, getting along excellently with all family members. She even had a warm relationship with her biological father, meeting him regularly and spending summer holidays with him. September 30th began like any other day. In the evening, Robin went to bed, but in the middle of the night, strange noises from the first floor woke her up. At first, she thought it was a bad dream. She heard her mother's voice and sharp bangs, but soon realized something strange was happening. Robin got out of bed and went to the door to listen. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, stopping right in front of her room. The door slowly opened with a squeak. Robin quickly jumped back into bed. The next moment, there were deafening noises as 2 objects flew just centimeters past Robin's left arm and leg, one leaving a mark on the closet. The stranger, apparently unaware, left the room and went to Zach's. Similar noises and quiet sobs came from the next room, and then everything went quiet. Robin froze in terror, motionless, and that saved her. She lay in complete silence, hardly daring to breathe, afraid to move. Every sound seemed like the steps of the stranger returning. Robin felt as though he was near, watching and waiting for her every move. She stayed in bed for nearly 2.5 hours before gathering the strength to get up. After cautiously checking her surroundings, she realized the stranger was no longer near. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone to call 911. Every movement was difficult as fear paralyzed her. She felt the stranger could hear her in the silence of the night. When she finally reached 911, she introduced herself with a trembling voice. "My name is Robin Dewan," she said, explaining she was scared and had heard loud noises and her family's screams. She had started searching for her relatives, fearing the stranger was nearby. There was a long silence and no one answered. Desperately, she asked the operator to find out where her family was. Upon reaching the kitchen, Robin stood by the window waiting for help. When she saw the patrol car's flashing lights, she ran toward the officers. Robin was traumatized and immediately taken to the patrol car. Several groups of officers began searching the house, taking all precautions, prepared for the unknown man still being inside. What they discovered inside shocked even the most experienced officers. Michelle, who was due to give birth in 2 months, was among the victims. The evidence found in the house indicated the use of an AK-47, a weapon rarely found in regular stores and usually ordered or purchased in limited quantities. While Robin sat in the patrol car hoping for a miracle, the officers returned to report that the unknown man had fled. Just as Robin calmed down, she began to cry again. She was then offered a ride to the station to speak with investigators. But first, Robin asked for food to help calm her. As she ate, it seemed as if reality had retreated. She quietly fed the goats in the stable and told the officials about how she and Zach had once won a competition. Then, the weight of her situation fully sank in. Dotchie grabbed the police officer's shoulder in tears and asked when her relatives would come out of the house. The officer had to tell her the painful truth about what had happened. Robin was then taken to the nearest medical centre, where, surrounded by the care of doctors, she finally became fully aware of the situation. As she wondered who would want to hurt her family, the psychologist needed time to work with her, but the situation was critical. The investigators understood the seriousness of the case and knew that every hour counted to prevent a recurrence of the events. After the examination, the doctors delivered good news. Robin's health was fine. The officers immediately took her to the station for a conversation and for her protection. Fortunately, she was willing to speak with the investigators, but unfortunately, Robin was not an eyewitness to the incident. The investigators explored the possibility of a recent conflict between her parents and someone, but Robin denied this. They also considered the hypothesis that Robin's brother might have been involved with questionable company or substances, but she rejected these assumptions as well. She could not name anyone who had shown hostility toward her family. Robin detailed everything she had heard, but couldn't describe the stranger's appearance. She had only briefly seen a dark silhouette without looking directly at it, so she couldn't provide any substantial details. The only thing she was sure of was that the stranger was light-skinned. One detail, however, puzzled the investigators. Robin was certain she had heard 15 bangs, and when the crime scene was examined, exactly that number of shell casings was found. It seemed odd that Robin could remember the exact number in such a stressful situation. Later she admitted that she had simply assumed there were more than 10 noises, which is why she had said 15. At this point, the officers were deeply concerned for Robin's safety. It was still unclear who had committed the crime or why. The unknown person appeared to be planning a more extensive operation and was determined in his intentions. Robin might still be in danger, so for her protection, she was placed in a special help centre under the supervision of her biological father, stepmother and stepsister. Law enforcement provided security. Robin, who had previously lived with her mother and stepfather, was now only under the care of her father. He arrived in the middle of the night to pick her up after her conversation with the investigators. They were escorted directly to the centre, where Robin was informed of the need for all precautionary measures and advised not to leave the premises. She understood the reasoning and feared the possibility of a repeat incident. The only exception was to say goodbye to her relatives, which she was escorted to by officers. The farewell ceremony gathered many local residents, many of whom knew the family and spoke warmly of them. The event shocked the entire local community. A quiet, rural Texas suburb had been shaken by this tragedy, and for Robin, the ceremony became a severe test. No one could believe what had happened to such good people. Law enforcement saw the situation as an opportunity to gather information, and word about the ceremony was publicly disseminated. Among the many people who came to pay their respects were plainclothes officers observing the proceedings closely. Special attention was given to Robin's safety, as she was surrounded by her father, stepmother and stepsister. However, nothing suspicious was noticed during the ceremony. By this time, the experts had completed their investigation of the crime scene. They had found essential evidence, including shoe prints inside the building and tire tracks next to the house. Experts carefully documented all traces, including the tire profile, but no further biological traces of the intruder were found, suggesting he had used protective gloves. At the back door, traces of forced entry were discovered. Surprisingly, the valuables, including a wallet with cash and other items, remained untouched. This led the investigators to believe that theft was not the motive. The intruder had acted methodically and cold-bloodedly, ruling out the possibility of impulsive behavior. However, no individuals with motives strong enough to commit such an act were found. The investigation into the family environment remained inconclusive. All members were law-abiding citizens with no conflicts. Robin's father was in a neighbouring town at the time of the incident, confirmed by his wife, who stated he had been at home. The experts continued analysing the collected evidence, hoping to find clues that could guide the investigation. Each piece could hold the key to solving the case. In the small town of Pineville, Missouri, the investigation gradually reached a dead end. The immediate family was cleared of suspicion, but the nature of the incident suggested deep-seated motives, possibly old grievances or unresolved conflicts. The relatives concerned began a day before the incident with the Robin family, when they were unable to reach them all day. When they returned in the evening, they found the house surrounded by barriers and police tape. Neighbours informed them of a serious incident involving Ori and Don McCool. The investigation team was still working at the crime scene. Criminal investigators questioned the arriving relatives, but they were unable to provide useful information to help identify the suspect. An interesting discovery was cartridge cases of an unusual caliber from an AK-47, a weapon rarely found in the U.S. The next day, local resident Mr. King contacted the police to report a break-in at his house. After returning from a business trip, he discovered his safes had been broken into and equipment was missing. Among the stolen items was exactly one AK-47. The connection between the incidents became clear. The investigation showed Mr. King had a solid alibi, as he had been in another city. However, other family members could have had access to the safe. The technical characteristics of the stolen ammunition matched the evidence from the McCool house. A ballistic examination was needed to confirm this, but first the tool used had to be found. The entire King family was summoned for questioning, except for one person, Levi, the son of the complainant who was missing. Levi had a difficult character and was on the run from justice. The 23-year-old man had a history of law trouble, having previously committed burglary, stolen valuables, and committed arson. He was sentenced to 14 years, but served less than 3. Shortly before these events, it was planned to transfer him to another correctional facility. Levi fled during transport. After the events with the Robin family, he remained on the run. At this point, the investigators had not yet linked the incidents in different states. Missouri police warned of the potential danger posed by Levi and alerted the public through the media, advising citizens not to approach him but to contact the police immediately. Thanks to King's report, the investigators had a photo of the suspect. The disappearance of a Dodge Dakota pickup truck belonging to the McCool family was also of interest. The vehicle was entered into the wanted list, and an arrest warrant for Levi King was issued in connection with the incident at the McCool house. Investigators suspected that the incident had no specific reason and the perpetrator did not know the family. Levi needed a means of transport to leave the state, and he was arrested by Border Patrol in El Paso, Texas, near the Mexican border. He was stopped, possibly planning to cross into Mexico. Surprisingly, he calmly informed authorities about the weapons in the trunk, which attracted attention. During the inspection, it was found that the pickup truck had been reported stolen. The arrested man, identified as Levi King, was taken to the local police station for further questioning. His behavior during the interrogation astonished the officers. In a short conversation with the investigators, Levi surprisingly confessed to the incident at the McCool house. He referred to the couple from Pineville, Missouri, and described their whereabouts in detail. A review of the information confirmed his statements about Ori and Don McCool. Levi struggled to explain the motives for his actions. According to his statement, he had broken into a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town to find a vehicle, and his choice had been made impulsively, driven by what he described as uncontrollable urges. During the inspection of the premises, the landlady came out to investigate the stranger's presence. King claimed he panicked and resorted to violence when he heard a noise. A man emerged, and in a state of panic, King lost control of the situation and continued his actions. He was immediately taken to Missouri for further investigation, where he confirmed his involvement in the McCool family incident. He also admitted to taking their pickup truck for transport. His confession then extended to the Robin family case in Texas, where the details matched the evidence found at the crime scene, including the same AK-47 shell casings. King had been operating on the ground floor when he heard movement upstairs. It was Robin, woken by the noise, who did not understand the situation. She went upstairs to check, and King began searching the rooms to eliminate possible witnesses. He then took some valuables and disappeared. Police in Texas confirmed his statements, and Robin, having narrowly escaped a tragic fate, was placed under the protection of law enforcement due to fears the perpetrator might return. Investigations confirmed the suspicions against Levi, and the tension finally eased. Robin was able to relax a little after days of sleepless worry. One day later, Texas investigators arrived to pick up Levi, and during transport he shared his feelings. He stated that the moments he experienced during the crimes brought him more pleasure than any prohibited substances. Even hours later, he vividly remembered the smells of gunpowder and sweat, which triggered a sense of euphoria in him. Levi confessed on video to the incident with the McCool family in Missouri, explaining that he acted on sudden impulses. He had planned to steal a vehicle to drive to Mexico, but on the way the urge returned. He noticed the remote Robin family house and broke in, choosing them at random, as he did not know them. Aware of the serious consequences, Levi attempted to flee to Mexico. In Missouri he faced a severe sentence, but on his lawyer's advice, he agreed to a deal with the prosecutor, resulting in 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. The hearings for the events in Texas were still pending, and the local prosecutor took a firm stance, refusing any compromises. Cooperation with the prosecution was out of the question, as the prosecutor was confident in the case's strength. However, the trial was expected to be complicated and lengthy, which delayed preparation for several years. During this time, Levi remained in custody in Texas without the possibility of bail. When the trial began, Robin was 14 years old, and the hearings took place just before her 15th birthday. She was outraged by the senselessness of his actions against her family, driven by inexplicable impulses. She firmly supported the harshest punishment for him. However, the defense attorney took a different stance, determined to represent his client's interests. Public opinion was divided. Some demanded the harshest punishment for King, while others felt a life sentence without parole was more appropriate. The defense tried to portray Levi in a more humane light, hoping to influence the jury's decision. They focused on his mental health, noting a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Levi's medical records also revealed diagnoses of depression, psychosis, and schizophrenia. Levi grew up in a large family, one of 7 children, but he lacked parental attention and care. His problematic behavior emerged early, starting with setting fires in primary school and showing unexplained aggression toward animals. Experts attributed this to the influence of his aggressive father and indifferent mother. The family's circumstances were far from ideal. The parents, struggling with addiction, neglected their children. The father introduced Levi to alcohol and illicit substances while regularly using violence in his upbringing. As Levi entered adolescence, he began using stronger substances. His living conditions were appalling, marked by poverty, poor hygiene, and constant pressure from his authoritarian father, Dot. When investigators first entered Levi King's house, they were shocked by what they saw. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a wall displaying a collection of firearms and blank weapons, some of which bore burn marks. Despite his financial struggles, Levi always managed to acquire shooting equipment and ammunition. This dangerous obsession directly contradicted the defense's narrative, which sought to portray him as a victim of unfortunate circumstances and a troubled childhood. The prosecution, however, argued that Levi was a dangerous criminal willing to break the law further. During the hearings, Levi's strange remarks about the smell of gunpowder made to investigators during his extradition from Missouri were brought up as evidence of his detached and dangerous mindset. Robin became the main witness in the trial, as she was the only survivor who had encountered the perpetrator. The trials were not easy for her. The years she had spent working through the trauma she endured could have unraveled. Yet Robin was determined to face the person who had taken her family away. Later, in an interview with journalists, Robin reflected on her first encounter with Levi in the courtroom. What shocked her the most was his lifeless, hollow gaze. Up until that moment, she harbored intense negative feelings toward him. But when their eyes met, she unexpectedly felt forgiveness. Robin realized her life was too precious to waste on hating someone who appeared utterly devoid of emotion. After learning about Levi's troubled upbringing, she concluded that he was beyond change. When the jury deliberated, they were particularly disturbed by the absence of any clear motive in Levi's actions. Everything he did seemed to stem from spontaneous, unprovoked impulses, targeting vulnerable individuals. The prosecution labelled him a particularly dangerous criminal and demanded the harshest punishment. The jury deliberated for hours, ultimately deciding against the death penalty. Levi King was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Despite the prosecution's objections, it was decided he would serve his sentence in Missouri. Robin's recovery was a long and challenging journey. She suffered from nightmares, was afraid to be alone, and hesitated to leave her house without someone accompanying her. Even years later, she faced difficult moments. However, the support of her remaining relatives helped her rebuild her life step by step. Every day, Robin remains grateful for the second chance. What drives humans to commit the most horrific acts against their own kind? What happens in the mind of someone capable of unimaginable evil? These are questions that have haunted us for years. Today, we delve into one of the most shocking cases in recent history to understand the darkness that can overtake a person. Martha Guzman Alvarenga was born in 2002 in the United States. She was the second daughter of Jorge Guzman and Amori Alvarenga, who had migrated from Olanchito, a small town in Honduras, in search of the American dream. They crossed borders illegally, hoping for a better future, not only for themselves, but for their daughters, Stephanie, their eldest, and Marta. They settled in Little Havana, Miami, where the neighbors lovingly called Martha Martica. Jorge worked tirelessly to support not just his family in Miami, but also children from a previous relationship back in Honduras. He and Amori took on any job they could to provide for their family. Despite the challenges, they raised their daughters with immense love. Martha was a joyful, beautiful, and playful child who loved dancing, acting, and spending time with her friends. The vibrant streets of Little Havana were her playground, and she spent countless hours swinging on a tire swing her parents had made for her. However, life wasn't without its difficulties. For reasons that remained private, her parents' marriage eventually fell apart. Martha stayed with her mother, Amori, while Jorge moved to a nearby residence to remain close to his daughters. Amori later began a relationship with another Honduran immigrant, Miguel Ruiz Lobo. Initially, the relationship seemed fine, and they had a son named Harold. However, Miguel's violent temper soon began to surface, especially when he drank, which was almost daily. Martha, though young, was very aware of Miguel's abusive behavior towards her mother and harbored little affection for him. Each time there was an episode of domestic violence, she pleaded with her mother to leave Miguel. By early 2014, after years of enduring Miguel's abuse, Amori finally heeded Martha's pleas and decided to separate from him. But Miguel, determined to maintain control, refused to accept the breakup. Using their son Harold as an excuse, he rented a room nearby to keep tabs on Amori's every move. He harassed her relentlessly, and although Amori sought help and filed multiple complaints and restraining orders, the legal system failed to protect her. In a final attempt to sever ties with Miguel, she filed for full custody of Harold, sparking a bitter legal battle. Miguel, unwilling to take responsibility for the breakup, directed all his resentment toward Amori and Martha, whom he blamed for the separation. On June 22, 2014, Miguel's twisted plan for revenge unfolded. That Sunday, Amori needed to run errands, but 11-year-old Martha asked to stay home and rest. Amori left with Harold, then 3 years old, after warning Martha not to open the door for anyone and to call her immediately if necessary. Martha, however, didn't understand that the warning applied to people she knew as well. Shortly after Amori left, Miguel showed up at the house. Trusting him, Martha let him in, unaware of the nightmare that awaited her. Once inside, the 43-year-old man brutally assaulted Martha, cutting her forearms in an attempt to stage her death as a suicide. But his rage overtook any desire to maintain the facade, and he left the knife plunged into her neck. In his eyes, his vengeance was complete. He fled the house without leaving any visible traces. He had no idea that his actions had been recorded by a neighbor's security camera. This turned out to be a crucial clue, which helped locate him at the scene and accuse him of the crime. According to the case reports, the young girl screamed, and some neighbors heard her, stepping outside to locate the source of the sound. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact house. When Amori returned home shortly after, completely unaware of what had transpired, she stumbled upon a horrifying and gruesome scene. Her daughter, Martha, was lying face down on the living room floor in a state that was far worse than anything imaginable. Amori, gripped by panic, rushed over and picked up her daughter in her arms, turning her over to see what had happened. Martha's forehead was sunken, her lips were swollen, and she had urinated in her pajamas. Her arms bore cuts, her body was strangely both hot and cold at the same time, and her legs had stiffened. Amori's immediate reaction was to try and remove whatever object might be lodged in Martha's throat, thinking it could help her breathe, but it didn't work. Desperation overtook her as she began screaming for help, her cries alerting the neighbors, who quickly gathered outside her home to see what was happening. One of the neighbors made an urgent call to emergency services, explaining the gravity of the situation. The rescue team arrived almost immediately and tried their best to revive Martha, but despite their efforts, she did not respond. Martha was taken to Jackson Memorial Hospital, but by the time she arrived, there was nothing the doctors could do. She had already passed away, and all they could do was declare her death. Martha's father, Jorge, had been working in South Carolina at the time, but as soon as he heard what had happened, he rushed back to Miami as quickly as he could. In the meantime, Amore, overwhelmed by the trauma and devastation of losing her daughter, had to be hospitalized due to a severe nervous breakdown. Both parents were utterly crushed by the loss of their little girl, struggling to process the tragedy that had just unfolded. While Martha's parents were consumed with grief, the neighbors began to gather around the house as word spread that Martha had been taken to the hospital. The scene outside the house was chaotic, with police patrols surrounding the area and yellow crime scene tape marking off the perimeter. Miguel, one of the neighbors, tried to act as though he was concerned about what had happened. He approached one of the officers on the scene and asked what information they had gathered about the incident. When people began to speculate that Martha might have taken her own life, Miguel seemed eager to support that theory. He went so far as to suggest that this wasn't the first time Martha had tried to harm herself, attempting to make it seem as though her death was a tragic yet inevitable event. However, this theory was quickly dismissed. When authorities asked Amore if Martha had ever expressed any thoughts of wanting to leave this world, her response was firm and clear. Martha had never considered anything like that. She was a happy, lively child, full of joy and energy. Martha's closest friend, Anil Perez, who had known her for years and grown up with her, also confirmed that Martha had never shown any signs of harboring dark thoughts. She was always playing, always laughing, and there was never any indication of sadness or distress. Upon closer inspection of the crime scene, investigators quickly realized that the evidence didn't point toward self-inflicted harm, but rather to an attack by another person. As the forensic examination progressed, it became clear that Martha's injuries were far too severe to have been self-inflicted. According to the forensic report, the cuts on Martha's forearms were so deep that they had severed her tendons, which would have rendered her hands useless. She wouldn't have been able to hold any object, let alone cause those injuries herself. This ruled out the possibility of suicide entirely. Furthermore, beneath Martha's fingernails, forensic experts found traces of skin, likely from her attacker. These samples were collected and sent to the lab for analysis, providing a crucial lead for the investigators. Now the authorities were in a frantic search for more evidence that could help them catch the person responsible for Martha's death, which had shocked and devastated the Latino community in Miami. Before long, suspicion fell on Miguel, especially after the police obtained the security camera footage from the neighbor's house. The footage showed Miguel entering Martha's residence around the time she was left alone and was attacked. When Amore learned that there was security footage capturing Miguel entering her house, she had no doubt that her ex-partner was involved in her daughter's death. She immediately told the police about the long history of violence and abuse that she had suffered at Miguel's hands, explaining that the likely motive for the crime was revenge. Miguel had wanted to punish her for leaving him. The Department of Children and Families also confirmed that there had been previous reports concerning the couple and that social workers had visited the home on more than one occasion. Armed with this information, the police brought Miguel in for questioning. During the interrogation, Miami Police Chief Manuel Orosa noticed that Miguel had scratches on his face. When asked about them, Miguel claimed that he had been at a party with friends and didn't know how he had gotten the scratches. However, the police believed that the scratches had likely come from Marta, as she desperately tried to defend herself during the attack. Despite their suspicions, the authorities had to wait for the DNA results to confirm their theory before they could make an arrest. Although the detectives were convinced that Miguel was responsible for the crime, and his story was filled with inconsistencies, they didn't have enough evidence to hold him, so they were forced to release him. However, they devised a plan to ensure that Miguel didn't flee. They asked Martha's parents to continue spreading the lie that Martha had taken her own life, hoping that Miguel would believe he had gotten away with the crime and would remain in the area while they awaited the DNA results. Meanwhile, Martha's family began the heartbreaking task of preparing for her funeral. It was an excruciating ordeal for her relatives, who struggled to comprehend the senseless loss of such a young life. To make matters even worse, Miguel had the audacity to attend the funeral, pretending to grieve alongside the family. His deception was sickening to everyone who knew what had truly happened. Despite his attempts to blend in, the family knew the truth, and Amore had to endure the torment of receiving messages from Miguel in which he expressed fake sorrow over Martha's death. A full month passed before the DNA results were finally ready, and the wait was agonizing for Martha's family. When the notification from the lab finally arrived, it confirmed that the DNA found beneath Martha's fingernails was a match for Miguel's. This gave the police the evidence they needed to make an arrest. However, on the day that Miguel was scheduled to be arrested, it seemed that he had vanished. Martha's father, Jorge, was growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation. He made the drastic decision that if the police didn't act soon, he would take matters into his own hands and track Miguel down himself. Fortunately, on July 21st, 2014, the police managed to locate and arrest Miguel on charges of first-degree murder, burglary, and violation of privacy against a minor by an adult. While this last charge was eventually dropped by the prosecution, the case against Miguel was strong, and justice was finally beginning to take shape. Jorge felt a sense of relief after Miguel's arrest, not only because justice was being served, but also because he hadn't had the chance to take impulsive action on his own. Despite Miguel's arrest, the pain of losing their daughter was still very raw for Amore and Jorge. During his second interrogation, Miguel no longer tried to weave elaborate stories or plead his innocence. Instead, he simply requested a lawyer and remained silent throughout the proceedings, awaiting his trial. Martha's parents were left grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, they were relieved that Miguel had been captured and would be held accountable for his crime. But on the other hand, the unbearable loss of their daughter continued to haunt them, and the uncertainty of the upcoming trial only added to their anxiety. The trial process proved to be emotionally grueling for Amore, Jorge, and their family. As they waited for the wheels of justice to turn, the community rallied around them, offering support and solidarity. The Latino community in Miami, deeply shaken by Martha's tragic death, organized vigils and fundraisers to support her grieving parents and to raise awareness about the dangers of domestic violence. In the courtroom, Miguel's defense team tried to paint a picture of doubt. They argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, wasn't conclusive enough to prove Miguel's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They attempted to introduce alternative theories, suggesting that someone else could have committed the crime. However, the prosecution countered with a powerful argument, emphasizing the overwhelming evidence against Miguel: his history of abuse, his presence at the scene, and the DNA evidence under Martha's nails. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Amore took the stand to testify about her relationship with Miguel. She spoke with raw emotion about the years of torment she endured at his hands and how she had done everything she could to protect Martha from his violence. Her testimony was crucial in establishing Miguel's motive for the crime: revenge for leaving him and for daring to build a life without him. Forensic experts also testified, explaining in detail how Martha's injuries were consistent with a violent attack. They reiterated that the wounds on her body couldn't have been self-inflicted, effectively dismantling any lingering doubt about the nature of her death. Throughout the trial, Miguel showed little remorse. He sat stoically as witness after witness described the events that led to Martha's death. The only time he seemed to show any emotion was when his defense team attempted to discredit the forensic evidence. However, the jury remained unconvinced by the defense's arguments, and after weeks of testimony, deliberations began. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury weighed the evidence. For Martha's parents, it was an agonizing wait. George, who had initially wanted to take justice into his own hands, now found himself praying that the legal system would deliver the verdict that would bring some measure of peace to his family. Amori, still recovering from the trauma of losing her daughter, sat quietly with tears in her eyes, holding on to the hope that her daughter's killer would be held accountable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury reached a verdict. On a hot afternoon in September 2015, the courtroom was packed with family members, neighbors, and members of the community as the verdict was read aloud. Miguel was found guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction brought with it a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Martha's family, the verdict was bittersweet. On one hand, they were relieved that Miguel would never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else, and justice had been served for their daughter. But on the other hand, no verdict could ever bring Martha back, and the void left by her death would never be filled. In the years that followed, Amori and Jorge worked tirelessly to honor their daughter's memory. They became advocates for victims of domestic violence, sharing their story in hopes of preventing similar tragedies from happening to others. They established a foundation in Martha's name, dedicated to providing support for children and families affected by domestic abuse. The Latino community continued to support them, holding annual events to raise funds for the foundation and to keep Martha's memory alive. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, they held a candlelight vigil in her honor, a solemn reminder of the bright life that was taken far too soon. For Amori, the journey toward healing was a long and difficult one. She continued to attend therapy to help cope with the trauma and loss. Jorge too found solace in his advocacy work, channeling his grief into helping others who had suffered similar losses. Though the pain of losing Martha never fully went away, they found strength in each other and in the community that had rallied around them. As the years passed, Miguel remained in prison, serving out his life sentence. He never expressed remorse for what he had done, and any appeals his legal team attempted were swiftly denied. For Martha's family, knowing that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars provided some measure of comfort, but the scars left by his actions would never fully heal. Martha's story became a symbol of resilience and the power of a community coming together in the face of unspeakable tragedy. Her parents' courage in the aftermath of her death inspired many, and their foundation became a beacon of hope for families dealing with the horrors of domestic violence. Though Martha's life was tragically cut short, her legacy lived on, a reminder of the importance of standing up to abuse and protecting those who are most vulnerable. In the end, Martha's family found a way to turn their pain into purpose. They couldn't bring their daughter back, but they could honor her memory by helping others and making sure that her death was not in vain. Through their advocacy, they ensured that Martha's light would continue to shine, even in the darkest of times.
Disclaimer. This piece is a journalistic compilation sourced from multiple reports. It does not reflect the opinions or official stance of the researcher or the media outlet distributing the content. The sources consulted are referenced throughout the narrative. Some professions naturally attract a higher concentration of individuals with psychopathic tendencies. Psychologist Kevin Dutton explored this unsettling truth in his investigative work. Among the careers listed, law enforcement was no exception, a field that demands emotional detachment, manipulation, and in extreme cases, violence. Within this dark reality falls the case of Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez, a former police officer from El Salvador whose story became a chilling testament to the danger such individuals can pose when power is abused. His case captured worldwide attention after his shocking arrest on May 9, 2021, amid the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. What police uncovered at his home in Chalchuapa would leave an indelible scar on the nation. Osorio Chavez was no ordinary criminal. He practiced rituals, carried out gruesome acts, and reportedly followed Santa Muerte, the Mexican folk saint often linked to death, the afterlife, and controversially, criminal acts. His crimes were so heinous that even the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, addressed the nation regarding the case. To this day, the exact number of his victims remains unknown, though at least 12 bodies were discovered buried in clandestine graves within his own property in the Las Flores neighborhood of Chalchuapa. Hello everyone, my name is Andrena, and 3 times a week on this channel we explore the most shocking crimes that have shaken the world. Stories of disappearances, heinous murders, and the heavy shadows of impunity, corruption, and justice. If you're passionate about the double life of Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez, known to some as Don Hugo, a seemingly ordinary man whose monstrous side shattered an entire community. When news broke in May 2021, the world met Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez, a 51-year-old man who earned the chilling nickname. His crimes quickly went viral, painting the image of a cold-blooded predator. But behind this infamous label existed a man familiar and even beloved by many, a friendly, polite, and charismatic figure. Neighbors described him as kind and soft-spoken, the kind of man who greeted everyone with a warm smile. He was equally comfortable chatting with teachers, merchants, or children playing in the street. It was as though 2 beings existed within Chavez, one angelic, the other demonic, coexisting in a fragile balance until the darker side took control. After bouncing around various towns, Chavez finally settled 109 kilometers northeast of Chalchuapa. There, his monstrous tendencies slowly surfaced. But before the truth emerged, he had firmly established himself as the good neighbor in the San Antonio II neighborhood of Cojutepec. Chavez arrived in San Antonio toward the end of 2018. He first rented a humble home in the neighborhood's first section, but by December 2019, he surprised many by buying a plot of land in the second section and building a house there in record time, a feat that raised eyebrows but was quickly forgotten in the face of his seemingly good nature. Today, locals still pass by the mustard yellow facade of that house, unable to believe the horrors it once concealed. Even now, many struggle to reconcile the image of the man they knew with the serial killer portrayed by the media. Some defend him, unwilling to believe he was capable of such evil. Others, however, whisper about his possible connection to several unresolved disappearances in the area, cases that remain unsolved to this day. Among them, Daniela Villatoro Peña, 14 years old, Carla La Cruz, 26 years old, Eduardo Arevalo, 28 years old. These disappearances haunted the community, and after Chavez's arrest, suspicions only grew stronger. A week before his capture, Chavez even joined a neighboring family on a day trip to the Apulo Tourist Center in the municipality of Ilopango. That memory haunts the family now. He was supposed to take us to a beach resort in Santa Ana next, a family member recalled. He seemed like such a good person. Only God can judge him. But now that we know what he did, it's terrifying to think what could have happened to us that day. Shortly after that outing, Chavez left Cojutepec and moved back into his mother's house in Chalchuapa. Between May 5th and his arrest on May 9th, he stayed in Las Flores where his gruesome crimes would finally be uncovered. According to neighbors, Chavez typically spent just 2 or 3 days a week in San Antonio. The rest of his time he was elsewhere, presumably orchestrating his horrific deeds. Journalists Daniel Valencia and Michel Recinos, who investigated the case thoroughly, gathered numerous testimonies suggesting Chavez worked as a lookout, possibly involved with local criminal groups. One anonymous source added a disturbing revelation. Chavez also acted as a coyote, offering to smuggle young women into the United States for a fee. One woman, aged 26, recalled how Chavez approached her cousin with such an offer that, in retrospect, might have been a death sentence disguised as an opportunity. This chilling detail would later become a crucial thread in the investigation against him. Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez was born on February 6, 1970, in Chalchuapa, a municipality in the Santa Ana department of El Salvador. The son of Antonio Chavez Cuellar and Mercedes Osorio, Hugo's early life remains largely undocumented, but some grim details about his family have surfaced. Reports indicate that Chavez had a brother and a mother allegedly connected to acts of violence themselves. Whether this is mere speculation or fact remains unclear. What is certain, however, is that Hugo grew into a man of imposing stature, dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, with a presence that could command attention or vanish into a crowd with equal ease. One of his most distinctive features was his gold dental inlays, which he proudly displayed whenever he smiled. That gleaming grin became part of his charm, a mask he wore so well that even his closest neighbors never suspected the darkness within. Week after week, Chavez traveled back and forth from Cojutepec to Chalchuapa. To some, he was just another face in the neighborhood, one of many struggling to make ends meet. To others, especially those who met his golden smile, he was unforgettable. But behind that charismatic facade lay a predator, one who carefully selected his victims, lured them into his trap, and buried them in the soil of his own home. His preference for vulnerable young women and his methodical approach to murder painted the picture of a cold and calculating killer. Even now, long after his arrest, the full scope of Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez's crimes remains uncertain. Authorities continue to investigate the graves uncovered at his residence, and families across El Salvador still wonder if their missing loved ones fell victim to the man who once smiled so brightly. As we close this story, one thing is certain: evil sometimes wears the friendliest face. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share if you want more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. Until next time, stay safe. Beneath his unassuming 1.70 meters of height, around 5 feet 7 inches, and the polite demeanor he displayed to those around him, Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez harbored dark secrets no one could have imagined. Known later as the Chalchuapa Killer, Chavez had once been a man of authority, entrusted with protecting the public. In 1997, he joined the police force, stepping into a role meant for those sworn to serve and safeguard. Yet 8 years into his service, the mask began to crack. By 2005, his twisted tendencies could no longer remain hidden. Accusations of soliciting sexual services and involvement in human trafficking surfaced, marking the beginning of his public fall from grace. Osorio Chavez was also implicated in the crime of counterfeiting, accused of possessing and altering currency. Justice was slow, but it arrived. Convicted, he served time behind bars until his release in 2010. Though stripped of his badge and uniform, Hugo Osorio Chavez carried with him the calculated nature of a predator, one no longer bound by law but shaped by his experiences within it. The final act of Osorio Chavez's brutal saga unfolded on a dark, suffocating night in May 2021. A scream tore through the silence of Estevez Alley, a desperate cry for help that would shatter the facade of the seemingly quiet neighborhood of Las Flores. It was this scream that ultimately brought his reign of terror to an end. It was Friday, May 7, 2021, when a sequence of tragic events unfolded, setting in motion a night that would expose the monster hidden behind Chavez's well-crafted mask. That evening, Don Hugo summoned a mother and her son to his home. Mirna Lima, 57, and her son, Alexis Palomo Lima, 24, believed they were meeting Chavez to finalize an agreement. Osorio had convinced Mirna that he could smuggle Alexis into the United States, a promise that came with a steep price. Mirna, desperate to secure a better future for her son, handed Chavez $7,000 up front. According to family members, that night was supposed to mark the start of Alexis's journey north. Instead, it became their last. Once inside the home, the situation spiraled into violence. Both Mirna and Alexis were attacked mercilessly. Osorio's predatory instincts took over, and he later admitted to sexually assaulting Mirna before taking both of their lives. Chavez's preferred hunting ground was often the digital world. He prowled social media platforms, particularly Facebook, where he sought out vulnerable targets. It's believed that this is how he lured Mirna and Alexis, through careful manipulation and false promises. But the horror didn't end there. That same night, Jacqueline Cristina Palomo Lima Cruz, 26, Mirna's daughter and Alexis's sister, arrived at the house, unaware of the nightmare waiting inside. What she found was beyond comprehension. Jacqueline entered the home and was confronted with the lifeless bodies of her family. Shock and horror took hold as she realized the grisly fate her loved ones had met. Terrified and desperate, she fled, her screams tearing through the darkness as she raced down Estevez Alley. Her cries for help echoed off the walls, drawing the attention of nearby residents. It was just before 10 p.m. Neighbors, hearing the frantic pleas, did not hesitate. They dialed 911, their hands trembling as they reported the unfolding horror. Meanwhile, Osorio, determined to leave no witnesses behind, grabbed a crowbar and chased after Jacqueline. He caught up to her, his rage fueling the brutal assault. With a vicious swing, he struck Jacqueline on the head, dropping her to the ground. Heartless and methodical, he dragged her limp body back to the house, adding another victim to his growing pile of the dead. Despite his efforts to silence the girl, her screams had already alerted the community. According to police records obtained by the digital newspaper, the first emergency call was logged at precisely 10 p.m. What followed was a series of bureaucratic delays and communication failures that nearly allowed the killer to escape. The call was received at the emergency center in San Salvador. Protocol demanded the case be transferred to the Chalchuapa subdelegation in Santa Ana, but repeated attempts to contact the local station failed. For half an hour the line rang unanswered. The connection had been down for 2 weeks due to unresolved technical failures, worsened by a recent thunderstorm that had damaged the lines. Frustrated but persistent, emergency operators decided to radio the nearest available patrol unit directly. 2 officers were dispatched, knowing only that a disturbance had been reported in the Las Flores neighborhood. Lacking specific details, they drove aimlessly, circling the area multiple times until a brave neighbor emerged from the shadows and pointed them toward house number 11. The officers approached the residence cautiously. Bloodstains on the ground led them forward, their instincts screaming that they were about to witness something horrific. Forcing open the door, they entered a scene straight out of a nightmare. Inside the cramped home lay the bodies of Myrna and Jacqueline, their lives brutally stolen. Yet, the horror deepened. Before the police arrived, Osorio had spotted the patrol car circling the neighborhood. In a desperate bid to avoid capture, he slashed his wrists and threw himself atop the women's corpses, feigning death. He hoped to fool the authorities into believing he was just another victim. However, something about the scene felt off. The officers swept through the house, eventually finding a shallow pit in the yard, a gruesome mass grave. Inside were the bodies of Alexis and another man later identified as Osorio's own brother. Prosecutors would argue that Osorio murdered his sibling too, adding fratricide to his long list of crimes. A judicial source later revealed chilling details too. When officers searched the house, they initially didn't realize Osorio was alive, but soon they noticed subtle movements. He was pretending to be dead, laying on top of the woman, but his body wouldn't stay still. The act failed. The officers subdued Osorio and transported him to Chalchuapa Hospital, where his self-inflicted wounds were treated. Photos released later showed the bandaged wrists, a failed attempt to escape justice through death. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they unearthed signs of ritualistic behavior. Osorio's crimes weren't driven solely by greed or desire. There was something darker at play. Reports indicated that Osorio was a follower of Santa Muerte, also known as Or, a controversial folk saint often associated with death and the underworld. Santa Muerte's cult has grown in popularity across Central America, especially among those seeking protection or power in criminal ventures. Her image, skeletal and robed, graced many of Osorio's personal effects, hinting at his belief that death itself was on his side. In the days that followed his capture, authorities uncovered more graves on the property. Each body told a story of trust betrayed, promises broken, and lives deemed expendable by a man who saw himself above the law, and perhaps even above life itself. In the end, it wasn't his calculated evil or his brutal strength that undid him. It was a young woman's scream, a final cry in the darkness, that forced the community to face the predator among them. A dark veil loomed over the discoveries at Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez's residence, one that would haunt El Salvador and draw the attention of the world. On the day of his arrest, investigators uncovered a chilling collection of objects that hinted at both ritual and terror. Among them stood an image of Santa Muerte, the personification of death worshipped by many in Central America. Around the macabre altar, candles flickered and eerie masks were scattered, objects believed to have been used by Chavez not just for his own beliefs, but also to instill horror in his victims during their final moments. A criminologist from the El Salvador prosecutor's office later described Chavez as fitting the textbook profile of a sexual psychopath. In an interview with AFP, the expert didn't hesitate to classify him as a serial killer, cold, calculating, and driven by perverse desires. According to the investigation, Chavez hunted his prey online, targeting the vulnerable with promises of work or dreams of a better life through migration. He lured them in with hope, only to unleash his worst instincts once they were within his grasp. What made the case even more chilling was the lingering possibility that Chavez practiced death rituals. The objects recovered from the scene, gruesome tokens, masks, and religious icons, suggested something more than mere murder. There was symbolism, there was intent. The expert was blunt in his assessment. Chavez wasn't just disturbed, he was utterly deranged. Even now, the true number of victims buried within Osorio Chavez's property remains one of El Salvador's most closely guarded secrets. Authorities handle the figures with reluctance, knowing well the public outrage that could erupt if the full scale were known. Early reports speculated about as many as 40 bodies concealed beneath the Las Flores neighborhood residence. During his initial arrest, Osorio himself admitted to multiple murders, and by May 18, forensic anthropologists confirmed the recovery of 15 bodies. Yet the information quickly became muddled. Political forces close to the president remained silent, and no disciplinary actions were opened against any officials involved. Days later, Justice and Public Security Minister Gustavo Villatoro appeared at a press conference to revise the body count, stating only 8 bodies had been confirmed. The confusion only deepened as new details emerged. Forensics discovered 8 grave shafts dug deep, some as much as 3 meters down, within Osorio's backyard. Later, the total climbed to 11 separate burial sites. The meticulous nature of these graves raised a chilling question. Had Osorio acted alone? Evidence suggested otherwise. Experts concluded that constructing such deep, organized graves required help, collaborators. By late May, forensic teams were making slow progress. Of the 11 clandestine graves, only 2 had been thoroughly processed. What they found was horrifying. One pit contained the remains of 18 victims. 14 were women. 2 were children. 2 were men. Press leaks revealed that Osorio's preferred weapons were cruel and personal. A knife and an iron pipe roughly 56 centimeters long. He offered his victims hope, jobs, safety, escape. When they came, he killed them. During interrogation, Osorio Chavez dropped another bombshell. He wasn't acting alone. He confessed to leading a group of 9 accomplices. But who they were remains a mystery. Their names, their roles, everything was sealed. The 9 accused were quietly placed in custody, their cases handled in secret in the city of Santa Ana, no photos, no public records. Further complicating the case was the looming shadow of MS-13. This brutal gang held firm control over the Las Flores sector. Journalistic investigations suggested that Chavez and his group might have colluded with MS-13, a group notorious for its brutality and deep roots in El Salvador's criminal landscape. The Chalchuapa killings sparked national and international horror, not just for the sheer number of victims, but for the sexual violence involved. Yet what truly enraged the public was the lack of transparency. Each press conference seemed designed to muddy the waters rather than provide clarity. Information was drip-fed, numbers changed, names vanished. Still, the human cost refused to be buried. Desperate families began arriving at the crime scene. Many clutched fading photographs of missing sons, daughters, wives, and husbands. They gathered outside the House of Horror, praying for news, closure, or at least a sign. Marlene Barrientos, 50, was one of them. Waving a picture of her son who vanished in 2015, she told Reuters she refused to give up hope. Maybe, just maybe, her boy's body would be found, and she could finally lay him to rest. Another family member of Camila Gabriela, also missing, stood nearby with her photo, wondering if Camila's final steps had ended at the Chalchuapa house. It wasn't until October 7th that a sliver of closure arrived. After months of forensic work, 12 bodies were finally identified and returned to their families. Prosecutors coordinated the handover, offering a grim consolation to those who had waited in agony. 5 of the bodies were returned to San Sebastian Salatrillo, where they had lived before vanishing. Graciela Sagastume, head of the prosecutor's femicide unit, confirmed that among the recovered were women, men, and 3 children. All were unearthed from the 11 secret graves dug into Osorio Chavez's backyard. But even then, Sagastume issued a chilling warning: this was not the end. She speculated that up to 30 more bodies could still be buried somewhere within the property. The task ahead for forensic teams was staggering. Many remains were so degraded, so mixed together, that extraction of usable DNA would be nearly impossible. Victims had been discarded like garbage, layer upon layer of lives erased. As the weeks dragged on, El Salvador's government faced mounting pressure. Social media exploded with demands for transparency. Hashtags trended, protests simmered, families wept in front of cameras begging for answers. But the official response was slow, fragmented, and sometimes defensive. Journalists attempting to cover the story faced obstacles at every turn. Access was denied, sources silenced. The government's reluctance to release clear data fueled speculation of corruption or cover-ups, especially regarding MS-13's involvement. 15 days after the initial discovery, the silence finally broke, but the damage was done. The Chalchuapa massacre had become more than just a crime story. It was a symbol of everything wrong in a country plagued by violence, impunity, and a system that seemed designed to forget the expendable. And so, the house remains, silent, hollow, and filled with secrets no one dares speak aloud.